So good morning and welcome back, everyone. I think we're going to be having people come in because there was a very long line for David's book signing. But we hope you all got a chance to make connections during the networking break. And thank you, Blueprint Medicine, for sponsoring that. And please check out the exhibitor pavilion, sponsored by PRA Health Sciences. You're all joining us this morning in track 4. What's Next? Science and Treatment for Rare Diseases. I'm Carol Dutch with Lumos Pharma, and I will be your breakout host for this morning's session. I would like to also welcome those of you joining us remotely through the live stream, and would like to remind you that you can interact with us using our live Q&A feature on the mobile app. Many new advancements have been made in neurological disorders, creating hope for those affected. Our speakers today will share with you the advances in development for these conditions in this session, Breakthrough for Rare Neurological Syndromes. So I'd like to welcome to our stage here, we have Amit Rakhit, CMO and Head of Research and Development for Ovid Therapeutics, and Lale Welsh, CEO of the Neuromuscular Disease Foundation. Lale is going to start us out, and she's going to give us the perspective from the advocacy side, and then Amit will bring in the drug developer perspective, and then we can open it up for questions and answers. So let's give a round of applause for our speakers. And Lale, please.
Thank you, Ms. Dutch. Hi, everyone. For those of you I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Lale Welsh, the CEO of the Neuromuscular Disease Foundation. I wanted to start off by telling you what we'll be talking about today, because at the last minute I came in and there was originally another speaker planned for today, and they asked me to speak from the advocacy perspective. And I just want to kind of give a blanket overview and let you know that I think that everything rare disease organizations do is advocacy, including every last bit of funding, everything. Everything that we do is for the patient perspective. And I'm going to sort of talk about why we are doing what we're doing, and then specifically how we are doing it. But before I start, I want to know, with a show of hands, how many people in here represent patient advocacy groups? Most of you, a lot of you. And then of those of you who raised your hands, how many of you are working on or towards gene therapy? 2, 3, okay, good, a good number of you, that's wonderful. So I hope that this talk will be helpful. I would love to hear your feedback about what we're doing, because this is a brand new world and it's a lonely one for those of you who think you're forging a path. Let me go to the next slide and tell you that in March of 2019, I read an article in Barron's magazine that said that big pharma is diving into gene therapy. Well, we knew they would, but when Barron's puts it out there, you know that there's a lot of money in it, or they wouldn't be running that article. And in fact, that is exactly what happened. When we started looking at gene therapy, and when I was recruited to be the executive director and CEO of NDF, that was the same year in 2015, about 5 years ago, where CRISPR had just really come out in a big way, and people were excited about it. And we knew vaguely that this is something that sort of sounded magical and could happen, but when this article came out, we knew for sure it was there. So what have we done in these past 5 years? Basically, gene therapy, and not to overload you with too much data or talk down to anyone, but it's a potential cure for hundreds of genetic diseases, like the one we work on, which is a form of muscular dystrophy. That Barron's article mentioned that there will be 10 new gene therapies approved every year. Currently, there's 3 or 4, but by 2025, there will be 10 new ones a year. Well, what does that mean to you guys? There's an estimated 5,000 rare diseases that are caused by a single gene mutation. Why is that important? Because that's what the gene therapy companies and biopharma are more interested in. It's easier to work on right now. This makes these particular diseases much more eligible to be targeted, to be worked on by these biopharmas. Even with limited patient populations, like rare, because people can say, well, how can you make money in rare? They can, because these treatments, when you do the math, at $850,000 to $4 million per patient, can generate revenues of over $1 billion. So what is that again? How does that translate? When you realize that there's big money in it, you can look at what that means to you and how you can make yourself attractive to partner with a biotech, because to be honest, you can't do it without them, and in a perfect world, they shouldn't do it without you. We understood this at NDF, but we knew that we had this vague notion that we're going to have to find a biotech, and this was revolutionary thinking, we thought. Find a biotech, convince them that they should look at our disease, because if you do the math with 5,000 gene therapies that could qualify, 10 new therapies a year, there's still quite a lot of competition in terms of why should a biotech look at you. We're all going to them cap in hand, asking for them to please take a look at our disease and spend the $50 to $100 million, is that about right, Amit, to spend on taking this all the way to market. So how are we going to do this? 5 years ago, when I joined the organization had been around for 9 years at that time, since 2006. But it was a family-operated business. It was like many of the groups here. It starts out with a parent who has a child who's affected, and they want to know what to do. We were in one zip code. That zip code happened to be 90210, but it was one zip code. And they were funding only one group of researchers at Hadassah in Israel. And we kind of vaguely knew that there was a Japanese mutation, but the Japanese weren't working with the Israelis, and the Israelis weren't working with the Japanese. And people were deteriorating, and we were getting phone calls every day. And I kept saying, well, what about this gene therapy thing that's coming? And they were like, oh my God, we don't know anything. Gene therapy's never worked. We can't do it. We don't really have an animal model. We don't have enough science. We don't even know what really causes this. We don't know if this gene is working with any modifiers. And so I realized, not being a scientist, that, all right, I'm not a scientist, I'm a strategist, and so we have to get ready for this somehow. And in that process, I'll learn. So what we set about doing was, and oh, by the way, we had one drug in development through a wonderful organization by the name of Ultragenics, and they had worked and brought a potential treatment called sialic acid to phase 3, and that was where we had pinned all of our hopes, and 2 years ago, that failed to meet its endpoint at the end of phase 3. So that was super depressing. And on top of that, we were poor. We were raising about $300,000 to $400,000 a year, and we knew that that wasn't going to be sufficient to do any kind of gene therapy, even if we were set up as an organization to do so. But then we figured it out. 5 years later, today, in 2019, we have presence in 29 countries, and we are on schedule to raise our 5th million in less than 15 months. In 12 to 14 rolling months, we've raised $5 million. And I'm going to show you how we did it. But we did it all by advocacy, through advocacy, by using our patients, taking them, organizing them, supporting them, and getting them all over the world. So those blue dots represent all the different countries that we have patients in. First, what we did was we started to host symposia. Every year, we would host a symposium at UCLA and invite all of the scientists and doctors and physicians that we knew had diagnosed patients. It was a small group. Then we started bringing patients together, and it was really meaningful because some of the patients had never met another patient with a similar disease. It was very moving to see. And When that happened, we started to identify certain patients who really needed to do something for themselves. Many of them had lost their jobs, but they still were very smart, very engaged, very active, and so we recruited them as what we now call CPAs. We created a certified patient advocacy program. With very little cost, what we were able to do is fly out patients from key countries where we felt there were bigger populations of patients, diagnosed or undiagnosed. We flew them out from places like India, Japan, Turkey, Israel, then Europe, United Kingdom, Italy, France. And we trained them. We had them listen to all of the scientists so that they knew and were educated on the most recent activities. Then what we did was we obviously paid for them to come, and they were very engaged. But then we sent them home with materials, data, things that they could reach out to local doctors with, and we gave them a stipend to do a patient day where they could replicate what we had done at UCLA in their respective hometowns. That turned out to be incredibly popular, and it was very well received. Through that, we were able to build a proprietary database of all of these patients, a natural history database, which of course to biotech is very attractive, because one of the things, if you're trying to partner with someone, that you can bring to the table when you are a patient advocacy group is details about your patients that can not only help biotech, but help the scientists to do the research to even get you to the place where biotech may be interested in discussing that disease with you. So I'm proud to say, and I really don't mean to sound conceited, but we have the largest natural history database in our disease of anyone in the world, and that's in spite of the NIH and and Ultragenyx working on and supporting the natural history data. And one of the reasons for that is because patients trust other patients. And so that has become a big thing that we can access and do. So as this movement grew, it just kept getting more and more attention and more traction. And like I always like to say, nothing attracts a crowd like a crowd. So we were able to step up our fundraising. And by this time, we had a little bit of a vision. Hey, listen, if we can get these patients together, we can identify and we can create better options for helping doctors identify patients and provide proper diagnosis, and we can take this information to our scientists, then we are ready. One of the problems was that the scientists were not working very well together. The nature of academia has it so that publish or perish. If they are working in silos, maybe doing the same studies, they're not sharing that information, they're not sharing their failures, they're not sharing their successes, and yet it's a peer review process, which was, I can write a book about the 9 layers of hell that is. So what I realized was that this, coming from Silicon Valley, that kind of thinking just offends me so much because it serves no one. It certainly serves the institutions, but it does not serve patients. It is inefficient, it's arcane, it doesn't work. But with the increased exposure that we got, we were able to apply for and persuade an organization to give us $2.5 million. This was the largest grant that we could have ever dreamed of. But because of an IRS law called the tipping law, where you're not allowed to get all of your funding or a major portion of your funding from any one organization, we had to make this a challenge grant so that half of it came from the organization and half of it came from the public. And that's why, since we received this in, I think, October of last year, we've raised $4 million. We need $1 more million by the end of the year, and we're on track to get that because we're having an enormous gala and you're all coming. But what did this do for us? $2.5 million, let's call it 5. Suddenly, the scientists that weren't working with each other started coming to us for grants. And that gave us an opportunity to write some legal language in there that said, listen, you want money from us, we want to give it to you, we want to keep your lab going, but you've got to share your data in a centralized database. If you put into it, you can get out of it what the others are putting in. You can still maintain your publishing rights, but we will not fund a nickel to anyone who does not collaborate with others. This has taken us about 15 months, but we finally have a very, very compliant group of scientists who are all working with each other, sharing mouse models, sharing muscle tissue samples, sharing data, even unpublished data. And we've created a feeling of trust among these guys, and it didn't cost us anything. It just took the effort of all of our patient advocates to be able to group this and create that kind of awareness. In turn, this has attracted more donors. Again, like I say, once you get this momentum going, it's really easy to keep it going if that's the direction and people feel that you're making progress. I'll tell you one thing that I will admit right now that we did not do very well is we had two choices. We were understaffed. Myself, Nancy, and Rachel, wave, there's just the three of us working at this company, and yet we, like I always like to say, punch above our weight, and people think we're much larger than we are, and they also think that they can push back, and there's a lot of patients that think we're this enormous organization, and they can call us and complain about how they're feeling, which is part of advocacy, I guess. But at the end of the day, it's been very, very successful to be able to get the scientists working together. That was a key missing piece. So now we have the patients working together, we have the scientists working together, we've got better awareness, and we've got some money. Finally, I just want to end on saying that in this process, we've been able to approach biotech companies that we have recognized are, in fact, working on rare muscle disease, because they don't all work. All of biotech, and I know we're going to hear from Amit later, but we definitely know that there are specialists. So, for example, Sarepta works with muscle. Their Spark works with the eye disorders. So we've identified the ones that work in our area. And we've literally gone to JP Morgan and sat with each single one of them and said, listen, we're coming to you with a sales pitch. We're coming to you with $5 million in key funding. We've already begun the studies that the FDA said that they wanted to see to show proof of concept. They came back with 14 different things that they wanted to see. We're doing every single one of those things. And we want to make sure that when we do go for an IND, which is the first phase in order to start testing on humans in phase 1, we want to make sure that we get that green light. With this many rare diseases vying for gene therapy, you can't afford to get it wrong, and you got to do it with a steady hand. So no matter how many patients call me on the weekly basis and ask me, how come we couldn't do this? How come we're not doing it yet? Where is it doing it? Come on, let's get it going. You have to remember that gene therapy, and this is something you're going to have to tell your patients, is it's a once-in-a-lifetime shot. Once you've modified your genes, scientifically, it's considered not a good idea to do it again. So we want to make sure that when we're dosing patients, we're doing it correctly and in the first place. So what we're telling these biotechs is, and I'm going to pitch you right here, right now. We are saying we've got the patients, we've got the data, we've got the science, we've got the studies, and we've got the money to mitigate potentially some of the cost that a biotech would have to invest in a disease from scratch. In exchange for that, what we want is guidance from the scientific team at those biotechs, because we want to make sure that when we line this up, it's all about manufacturing, guys, that we're not doing it around an AAV or a vector that ultimately isn't going to make money for somebody. And unfortunately, that's the reality in the United States, where money and healthcare are so closely bound, you have to consider what's in it for them. And I think it's not a bad strategy for all of you. And I think that all of you can do this as well. I'd love to hear from those in the audience who have already done this and where you are in that process. But where we are is actually in a good place. We're going up to them, we're saying we've done the work, you've mitigated your potential losses, and yet if you promise to take this all the way to market, if we get a yes at the FDA IND level, then, you're the one that we will look to and you make all of the profits. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a win for the biotech, it's a win for the patients, and it's certainly a win for us, because once that happens, then we can go back to making sure the quality of the lives of the patients that are living with disease are actually the job that we're doing, which is the core reason for us to exist and leave the science to the scientists. And in my humble opinion, that is what advocacy is all about. So thank you so much for listening to my little talk. Okay, I guess I'll let you introduce yourself.
All right, thank you. Oh, it was great. So I got this. Well, thanks for inviting me, and that was a great, inspiring talk about how you've worked with advocacy organizations and created this foundation. So, quick introduction. Myself, my name is Amit Rakhit. I am the Chief Medical Officer and Head of Research and Development at Therapeutics. And Therapeutics, we're a small but I would say impactful company that focuses on rare neurology conditions. And one of our original and first areas of focus have been neurodevelopmental conditions like Angelman syndrome and Fragile X syndrome. But we've also expanded our portfolio in looking at rare epilepsies, so conditions like Dravet syndrome, Lennox-Gastaut, CDKL5 deficiency disorder, and Du15q syndrome. And what we've learned along the way is that there is a power with patients and families and people affected by rare conditions. And that's what we try to infuse in our culture and our way of doing work every day, is really understanding what is needed for us to all come together and pull different areas together, whether you're a patient, whether you're a family member, whether you're an advocacy organization, a healthcare provider, a researcher or drug developer, or even a payer. And so my background really is also as a pediatrician. So I'm a pediatric cardiologist. I used to be on staff at Boston Children's Hospital. And I do carry that clinical mindset as well as I think about all the opportunities that we have to make a difference for families and people living with rare conditions. Well, if you look back and where we've come, for decades, rare diseases have been, I would say, left behind of the bigger areas of primary focus and primary care. There weren't many natural history studies. We didn't understand what it was like to live with a rare condition. How did you get diagnosed? What happened? How many people did you have to see before somebody understood that maybe you were living with a rare condition? What were the therapies that were available to you? Oftentimes it's just symptomatic. We couldn't really address the underlying cause, and sometimes because nobody knew what the underlying cause was. The standard clinical trial approach, if you look at the industry, wasn't appropriate for many of our conditions, as you know. When you're looking at conditions that maybe have 80 people living in just the United States alone, it's difficult to do a large phase 2 or a large phase 3 clinical trial. And where did you find information? Where we found information for our Ovid perspective, we actually went to the patient community, the families, because they knew more than many of the researchers and clinicians out there and really pointed us in the way of what was happening. And so when you look at these aspects, there's other things also that you think about from other areas of the industry and the healthcare system, specifically access. Access can sometimes be restrictive. So even if there is a potential therapy, maybe there's a high cost. Maybe there's limited resources available. And so even once we do have potential, there are other barriers that we really need to address. But really now, I think that's changing. It's really coming to an end. And we've seen so many changes that have really moved this community forward. And it's really transforming the rare communities that we work with. So this presentation, I was asked to think about what are some of the trends in the neurology space that we see. I picked 5 trends. So this is my view. There may be others. You may or may not agree. But I challenge you to think about some of these perspectives because it's all about different focus on healthcare from different perspectives, whether you're a family member, a person affected by a rare condition, a payer, a researcher. These are things that I think we are all in common that I pulled out as kind of the top 5. And while going through this, I'm going to relate to you a little bit about my own personal experience and how I first got involved with rare diseases. Specifically, I'll relate to you that I actually used to work at Biogen and was part of the development program that led the SMA therapy nusinersen or Spinraza. And the reason I was really passionate about that is that as an intern, as a pediatric intern in 1995 at Tufts Medical Center, I remember a little girl who was admitted with SMA, and she had been admitted with bronchiolitis. But I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a little bit. But my first question to you is, if you think about it, what's the newest tool for reducing the number of seizures a pediatric patient experiences while on treatment? Now, you may think and wonder a bit, what are some of those available tools that are available? But if you did think something mobile, like an app or a phone or some sort of digital tool, you're probably not far off. Many of the conditions that we see today have been transformed by the smartphone. The smartphone is actually available in some of the most rural areas of the world and some of the most remote parts of the world, which are transforming the way we understand and deliver healthcare. And we're still really looking into what that impact is, whether it's telehealth, and I just recently looked at my insurance app and said instead of going to the doctor, I could actually have a telehealth visit using my phone. Whether it's electronic health records, so as you know, there's a movement to really think about having a global ID, whether you're an individual person taking your health records with you wherever you go. Or even in the industry, we see clinical trial, there's a movement towards creating a global patient ID so that no matter which clinical trial you participate in, you can actually consolidate all that information so that people can make really informed decisions as well as understand what the impact is of different therapies. E-learning or education and social media. As you know very well, the patient advocacy community is connected through social media because of the geographies involved. If there isn't that many patients or people here affected in one country, you can connect with others who are experiencing similar symptoms or the disorder in the condition in different areas of the world. So thinking about geographic barriers being torn down by our electronic ability to connect. Big data is something that's been around for a while, and our ability to look into big data, and M-Health overall in general. So if you look at the industry, we're looking at ways to go beyond the pill as a common terminology you hear, but these wraparound services that really think more about what you need or what somebody needs or a family needs to really live with a rare condition day to day, beyond just the medication, beyond just the pill, beyond just the IV infusion. So this is really transforming the way we address these unique areas around healthcare. It's real time, it's clinical trial information, it's data to clinicians, it's data to you. It's increasing our awareness and health education. It's informing our data capture and how we think about that, whether it's symptom tracking or even how we connect with resources. And a couple examples here are this one, for example. Looking at this trend number one, which I would call the digital health revolution, there are apps and multiple tools that are using these digital resources. This one here in particular is about lupus. And if you look at this log, it actually will track symptoms of lupus and how it affects a person's daily life, looking at the progression of the condition, looking at understanding the symptoms in a day-to-day, and so that this organizes information for someone so that they can recall what happened 3 weeks ago. I have difficulty to remember what I ate for lunch 2 days ago. So thinking about how you actually can track, this is a resource and tool for somebody who can follow their own progress and their own condition and really help make informed choices with their healthcare provider. Another example of looking at resources in the digital space is academia is actually taking a look at this. This is an example from Penn. This is around sarcoid. Now, if you have sarcoidosis and you need to find someone who's a specialist, this app can help you. There shows a location. On the left side, you see little dots on the geography of people who are specialists in sarcoid. It can actually connect you to the advocacy organizations if you don't have resources yourself. It can actually track symptoms, and this is one app that's actually looking to improve quality of life of people who are affected by sarcoidosis so that they will be able to inform the community, and you can participate just by using this app on your phone. So moving on, the second thing I'd ask is how do we know how to impact rare diseases like never before? So remember I mentioned my little girl who I used to know with a 6-month-old with bronchiolitis. So in the morning while I was in the ICU, I was doing rounds as an intern, and there was a pediatric code called for a cardiac arrest. And those of you know New England Medical Center or Tufts Medical Center now, it's a mixed pediatric and adult hospital. So it's very rare for a pediatric code to be called. And so as I was walking around with my group in the ICU, we heard the code call, and we said, oh, this is a pediatric code. So I remember rushing into the room, to the floor that they were on, and it was already full of people and equipment, tubes, medicines. There was a flurry of activity. People were just really looking to see this little girl who was breathing with the most difficult breaths, and you can see the ribs come forth every time she took a deep breath. Because SMA, as you know, is a muscular disorder, and what happens with bronchiolitis, which for you and me might be just a bad cold, for this little girl, it was life and death. And as she took her last breaths, as the ribs pointed out, she ultimately died. But flash forward now, it's 25 years later. There's an explosion of individualized gene therapy. Whether you are looking at an ASO, a gene therapy, microRNA, that area has exploded as we understand more and more about the underlying causes of illnesses. More than 80%, as you know, of rare conditions are monogenetic in nature, and our understanding has really helped propel this area forward. If you look at the number of companies that are looking at gene therapy or some sort of molecular therapy, more than 320 companies can be quickly identified. There are more than 600 products either in clinical development or already on the market, about 22 alone in the neurology space. And more than $8 billion has been spent. That's up about 40% from a year and a half ago. And so our understanding of this space is only continuing to grow. And I point out one example is Dr. Timothy Yu's lab, and I'm not sure if he's here today, but at Boston Children's Hospital, he's been looking at areas of accelerating the ability for us to understand the underlying cause and the fundamental causes of genetic disorders. And in his lab, he was able to get from a genetic construct, just a gene construct in a preclinical space, to an individualized therapy in the clinic to a girl who's had Batten syndrome in just a little bit over a year. So thinking about our understanding, that acceleration of being able to drive forward from preclinical to a clinical therapy in about a year is almost unheard of and would not have been able to be done 25 years ago. But our ability to do that now is trailblazing. So looking forward now, should rare disease efforts be focused on a global level or a local level? So it's kind of a trick question. So it's both, right? So knowledge sharing is caring. And I think you could do both now at the same point. So there's no room now for the publish or perish, as was mentioned previously, or the data silos. So even if you look at some of the new guidances in Europe and the US, most people would say that patient advocacy organizations should be the owners and managers of disease registries. It shouldn't be in the industry. It should be with the people who are most close to that condition. And that way, the data is not lost. So you can actually have that information available, and so that if for one reason or another, a industry partner or another partner, academic partner, decides not to pursue that registry, the patient advocacy organization can still control that information and have that available for future researchers down the road. Companies should publish their information, whether it's positive or negative, and that's something that we've been trying to do for years in the industry. I think there are some challenges sometimes. Sometimes it's slower than what we would like, but overall, I believe that there is an inherent wish to be transparent and share information, because that's what's going to make a difference in this space. And if you look at what's going on already, there is sharing happening all over the world. So if you look at some of these examples, Care for Rare has been around for a while. It's a Canadian collaboration of clinicians and researchers and scientists working together from 21 academic sites across Canada. Euronomics and Neuromics, they contribute to a shared database called RD Connect. This is a European collaboration of more than 100 clinical researchers and clinicians and academic industry partners across Europe. Orphanet. It was started in France in 1997 and has grown to include more than 40 countries contributing to the information around research, their projects, looking at understanding genomes. And in the US, the Centers for Mendelian Genomics and the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network, part of the NIH, has been bringing together more than 2,500 researchers, clinicians, and consortia that have been sharing information. So there is a wealth of information out there to tap into, as long as you know where to look. What's the number one problem facing, though, rare disease treatments in the real world? Let's say we get to a treatment. Given all these advances, what are some of the worries that people have? And typically, it's another way to pay, it's cost. If you think about what's going on right now, even recently, cost is a huge factor. If you think about SMA, one of the current therapies, Zolgensma, it was an IV infusion. One-time therapy, one-time gene therapy for SMA is rated as one of the most expensive therapies in the world. So a one-time treatment for Zolgensma in the US costs $2.1 million. But what's the alternative? So going back to the patient I knew with SMA, if you think about it, about 30 years ago, here's the conversation I would have with somebody and a family member who was just diagnosed with SMA. Your child has spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA. There's nothing we can do. There are no treatments, there are no cures, and we can only do symptomatic therapy. Survival beyond childhood is unlikely. That's what you heard, and that's what actually Nathan Yates, who's a professor of economics and finance at Southern New Hampshire University, said that his parents heard. He has SMA. He was quoted in Stat News this last May, and he tells about how SMA impacted his family and how that news about having no therapies affected his life. And so, given that alternative now, what would you say? But states, nations are looking at how we can actually address this healthcare system and the budgets, because it's a partnership. We have to think about different ways of making the system work. One of these options, I'll mention in the US, is Louisiana. Louisiana has a model for hepatitis C. As you know, recently there have been hepatitis C cures that have been approved by the FDA, but they're still out of financial reach for many people. Come in Louisiana. Louisiana has a population of people who are affected by hepatitis C, and they would like that treatment option to be available. What they propose is what's called the Netflix model. It's a subscription system. So instead of paying individually, instead of the state paying individually for each drug prescription, there's a subscription available so that the state benefits and is able to cap some of their spending, but also they have a direct partnership with the manufacturer who's able to also have revenue from the sales of the hepatitis C treatment. Another example is Michigan. Michigan and Oklahoma recently got approval to negotiate Medicaid. So typically, as you know, with CMS, Medicaid prices is done with CMS, and the states typically aren't able to negotiate further pricing. And so in this model, this is more of an outcomes-based payment system. So what they've looked at, and this is in their basket currently, is looking at a couple compounds, Aristada here by Alkermes, it's an antipsychotic, or Bactiv, which is an anti-infective by Melinta, Ficampa for epilepsy by Eisai, and Invega, both Trinza and Sustaina by J&J, are both antipsychotics. And there's different payment criteria depending on patient adherence, hospitalization, net costs, that actually is a plan to help reduce the healthcare burden on the states. And if you've been watching the news lately, there was a plan just announced by Nancy Pelosi that was unveiled yesterday which allows Medicare now to negotiate prices for more than 250 different compounds. So they're using an international price index as a way of controlling costs. So cost is something that's going to continue to play a big factor in whatever therapies that come forward. And it's great to make sure that we are all aware of what's going on, because it's still a partnership. We still want the best treatments and therapies available for people who are affected by illnesses. But we also need to make sure that the system, the healthcare system, can really provide the resources that are needed to make sure that happens. And it's not just the US alone. If you look across the globe, and this is an example from Manchester in the UK, this is an area that they're looking for in terms of cancer research. So they're looking at outcomes-based payments for their cancer therapies. And their goal here is to provide therapies and treatments to people who have different types of cancers, so that in 15 years or so, they have a survival rate that's much more higher than they have now, 75% of people surviving from their illness. So this is something that's far-reaching, not only in the US, but across the globe. So what's the most valuable resource for designing and prioritizing our rare disease research efforts? And I think this is probably will not come as a surprise to anybody here. It's really the patient. It's the patient-centric everything. Now, this is a term that's been around since I first started the industry 20 plus years ago, is patient centricity. But now I see that there's more and more tangible evidence that that's really happening. Because when it comes to designing clinical programs or trials, it's not so easy in the rare disease space. It's not so easy to define what the roadblocks may be. It's really important to understand that our outcomes need to be specific for what we are really needing to accomplish with the rare community. And some examples in the industry are shown here. So we have a partnership with Takeda. Takeda actually has a program where they do mock trials. They involve the patient community before they do a clinical trial. They design and change their designs based on that feedback that somebody might provide them during these mock interviews. At Ovid, we believe strongly that we should involve families and patients very early in the process. And even with our Angelman syndrome community, with our Fragile X community, with the DUP15 community, we've really endeavored to understand what it's like living with this rare condition. What is it that you need? What's an outcome measure that makes sense? We've even modified clinical trials. When we do a mock study day, is 2 hours too long for you to sit through questionnaires? Is 4 hours too long? Is it easier to do it at home? We really make sure that we understand what's going to be in the best interest for families and try to make that really easy for them, but also to make sure that the scientific trials have this rigor that we need to move them forward from a scientific and regulatory perspective. Another example is Janssen. I think this is a new trend. Janssen has Sightless clinical studies. So this is the MSTOP study, which is looking to screen people who have atrial fibrillation before they have a stroke. More than 2,500, 2,600 people are actually involved in this study. And this is where the clinical trial site is now the patient's home. The person's home becomes your site. So it really means that you don't have to travel. You can use digital technology, and you can actually look at contributing to this important study with a network of people and sites who are basically at home. So that would be my trend 5. So if you look at the 5 trends, the first one being that there is the mobile health therapeutics and technology that's offering ways to revolutionize how we do clinical trials and patient care. There is an explosion of individualized gene therapy that's untapping potential for gene therapy that we have never seen before. Knowledge sharing, it's global. It's globally able to share knowledge and data with so many rare disease categories that are even being better understood today because of our ability to connect. Novel access and pricing models really aiming to increase the accessibility and affordability of these conditions and these treatments, leaving no patient behind. And a deeper engagement with patients and patient organizations can really maximize the success of what we see. So I'll just leave you with what I didn't tell you, what they don't teach you in med school and in the textbooks, is that, so when somebody dies after a code, so after the adrenaline kind of starts to wear off, and after the activity starts to lull, there's usually a silence. And no one really looks at each other. There's a quiet. You're kind of left to your own thoughts. And I remember like that quiet was broken. And as I was sitting there with my own thoughts, I heard crying. And it was like the soft crying of her mom who had just lost her baby girl. So flash forward now 25 years. We're now at a time that we've pushed forward as a community. We've learned so much more from the past. We're active. We're sharing experiences and knowledge. So we can make a difference for so many people that are affected by rare illness. So what really becomes rare is that crying from that hospital room. So I challenge all of us to join the community if you're not here. Stand up, learn from each other, educate others, increase awareness, make a difference, even though you may think it's just small. Because while the community may be rare, it's really time now to hear it roar. Thank you.
Lale and Amit, thank you very much for this very, energizing, knowledgeable presentation. We have quite a few questions from the app, but I'd like to open it up to people in the audience. If you can raise your hand, I'll come by and grab you. All right.
I have more so a comment versus a question. My grandson has SMA type 1, and he was diagnosed at 7 months, and we were originally told he had 2 months to live. So your story very much so hit my heart or whatever. He was lucky enough to get into a trial immediately for Spinraza, the first drug, and then my daughter is now pregnant. And we're just so grateful for the gene therapy drug that is there, so we know that her daughter will have a chance no matter what. So your story just very much so touched me, so I just wanted to,
Thank you for sharing. Thanks, Deb.
Thank you.
Good luck to you.
So Lale, we have a question here. What is it about your foundation that you found that biotech companies are most interested in? Is it the number of patients, the single responsible gene, the tissue samples you've collected, the research you've been done by your scientists? What?
That's actually a really good question. It took us a minute to figure out what was in it for the biotech. Probably that's a great question that you can address too, but I think what we've noticed in our discussions is definitely a combination of things. Number of patients is always a question they ask before they get to know you. I've even spoken to biotechs that say, unless you've got 1,000 identified patients, we kind of don't want to talk to you. And that breaks my heart. But hey, it's about money. That's probably not the kind of biotech we would choose to work with if we had a choice, but we really don't. Beggars can't be choosers. We've been fortunate in that we've met some really good biotechs. I'm under non-disclosure agreements. I can't really identify who we're talking to, but I can tell you that the thing that they're interested in the most does seem to be the natural history information, which really, I think you re-emphasized what I said, which is the best people qualified to collect this data under the tutelage of a professor, academic, or doctor of some sort is really the patients themselves. So that's worth millions of dollars. You may not realize it, so putting in the mutation information, natural history information, the disease age, so on and so forth. I think the other thing that's really important is to come, if you can, with a collection of scientists that already collaborate. because these biotechs also have their own scientists, but if they can work with each other, and I love that you re-emphasize the silo problem, is really pushing for that. So I think those two things are probably the most important. That was a really good question.
Hi, this question is for Amit. You mentioned how difficult it is when there's rare patients, say there's like maybe 80 in the world, for research to be done on them. My daughter has an extremely rare neurological condition. If you look up the occurrence rate of it, it says there's over 20 reported cases in medical literature. It's called U-Hall syndrome. It combines Charcot-Marie tooth disease with Potocki-Lupski syndrome. And we're having difficulties with her going back to the hospital every month because they can't pinpoint the cause, they just treat her symptoms. And I was kind of wondering if there's any organization or company that you could recommend that we could maybe investigate or be in contact with to help our particular situation.
No, so I think, so the point about the rare conditions, so when there's only 20, 30, even less sometimes, that's very challenging. So happy to discuss with you afterwards a couple of options, but I think if you think about, there are umbrella organizations. I know NORD, for example, is an umbrella organization. Global Genes is an umbrella organization that can help direct through resources. But I think these are the areas that are probably have the highest need. And you'll find that there are many either companies, academics that are also very interested in making a difference there. So happy to talk offline about that. But
Okay, thank you.
Amit, here's an online question, and I'll get to you. How can rare disease patient registries help pharma companies with their post-marketing surveillance regulatory requirements? And is there a technology that will be required? What should rare disease organizations look for in a partner?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So Liza mentioned and Lale mentioned also, registries are very important because it gives you a sense of not only the natural history, what happened before therapies are available, but also you can see what happens after a potential treatment option is given. One of the challenges with registries is that when you have global registries, you see there's kind of this inconsistency of how you collect information. So one of the biggest challenges that we have is that inconsistent information because you may collect certain scales, let's say, or attributes in one country, and you may not do that in others. There's ways around that, but I think that consistency across when you create a global registry is information that's important and for sharing. But even if you don't have that, I think that long-term information, especially as therapies come on board, is important in the post-marketing space because it gives you an objective way of looking at information, especially as other therapies potentially come into the space. So both those are important, both in the pre-therapeutic area space as well as post, which will be helpful no matter what, to not only the industry, but also from even when you're thinking about access to healthcare is also very important.
Hi, my name is Amber Freed. I'm with SLC 6A1 Connect. My two-year-old son was diagnosed with a mutation on SLC 6A1. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder. It's progressive, turns into refractory epilepsy. We have had a diagnosis for a year. We're working on a curative treatment, gene replacement treatment with Stephen Gray from UT Southwestern. My question for you is, it's equally important to involve a biotech, but also find the right partner for your patient population, for the university. At what point would you recommend involving the biotech side and interviewing the right people for you?
So I can only speak from my experience. I think I would say the earlier the better. So at Ovid, we reached out to the community before we even knew exactly what our development program was going to be, and specifically in Angelman syndrome. And we learned from the community, and we fostered a partnership together. So much of our development program, it has direct input or had direct input for understanding what the community, what's important to the community. And so the earlier the better. I think you really start to impact the overarching strategy and how to actually make a difference, how to make a treatment move forward. And it's the understanding on both sides. So what we can offer is helping people learn about the development process. What does it mean to manufacture, like you mentioned, manufacture? What does it mean to go through the regulatory process? What are they looking for? But I think in rare conditions, there's an opportunity for all of us to really transform that model. And I say that's the big challenge here, is that I think we've seen much more progressive thinking in many of the regulatory authorities, scientific community, clinicians, even the payer community. But how do we actually push that envelope forward so that you can address very rare conditions and make clinical development programs that are appropriate for the size of the community?
Can I just tack on to that answer? I want to address for you, and there's probably other people out there who have this similar question, similar approach. I love your approach that we're interviewing a biotech and we really want to know, if you're right for us. That's great, but remember, there's more diseases than there are biotechs able to help you. So that's one point that I really want to confirm. And the other one is that I think, as you mentioned, the earlier the better, because we learned the hard way. We spent a year and a half doing a pre-IND process with an academic, I will not mention the name or the organization, who literally wasted our time with trying to repeat studies that didn't need to be, did not work with the other scientists, and held us back. In the end, it turned out to be okay, because we've learned from those who went before us. But it is extremely expensive. We have a saying, time is muscle. And when you waste that, it's really a problem. And if the sooner you can involve a biotech, the sooner they can give you guidance on, look, this guy can only get you to phase 1, and even then we're going to have to go back and redo all of those studies because he didn't do it with the right vector. Okay, so these are things that you can't possibly know unless you've either learned them the hard way like I did, or you actually talk to a biotech and get their input from the get-go. Somebody that can take it much further than phase 1, that can take it all the way to market, and those are few and far between. So I beseech you to think about that.
If we can squeeze in one more question with time, here you go.
So my question is around data silos. I know, Amit, we work together on this, but in general, when pharma collects data on your population related to a trial, what's your view on that data coming back to the partner? Meaning that it's opened back up, it's used for other people afterwards.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's, and it has some other questions embedded into that, right? So I think there is an overarching in the industry, a commitment to transparency, data transparency, and sharing information, both positive and negative. Once you do have the challenges with positive information, right? So then that actually potentially moves that forward to a development plan forward. It then potentially has regulatory perspective. So you want to be able to make sure that the data is, if it's supposed to be blinded, for example, it stays blinded. And so, for example, for ongoing trials, it's hard to share data when you're looking, if a regulator, for example, is looking for blinded information. And so the baseline information might be challenging because that may inadvertently impair the integrity of your study. So I think there is, most companies, and we do also have at least a couple years after the study is all final, that there is actually data transparency. For anybody who's a researcher who wants to understand and have questions, many people have processes in place to share data that they have. And then our commitment is really to share that information broadly with the community. It just depends on a little bit about what's the development plan. And typically the challenge comes is when there's blinded studies, or the study is somehow linked to a blinded study, that you want to make sure that you're not just able to share that information just yet. But I think the commitment is there. The easiest way to go around that is to think about what questions you have and what information you're looking for, and many people are very, very happy to share that information. We do that a lot with and we're actually going through that right now with our community, with the Angelman syndrome. We're trying to see how we can actually best share the information we have available from our phase 2 study, even though we're in a phase 3 blinded study now.
So thank you very much, Amit and Lale. Let's give them a round of applause.